Today in Inside Utah Politics, the 2022 legislative session, it begins this week. Brian Schott with the Salt Lake Tribune is here with insight on what to watch for this year. Plus, battling inflation, the Fed chair in the hot seat on Capitol Hill. Senate Republicans pushing him to act fast, while Democrats say it could hurt average Americans. We'll hear from both sides.
Time now for Inside Utah Politics.
Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Glenn Mills. It is time to go inside Utah politics. We do begin this morning with Salt Lake Tribune political correspondent Brian Schott. He's here to preview the legislative session. Brian, always glad to have you on the show. Thanks so much for being here.
Always a pleasure, Glenn.
So you've been keeping a close eye on interim. So as we get closer and closer, now just a couple days out to the session beginning, what's the feeling this year going into it?
Well, there's a lot of talk about tax cuts. They want to do that again. Back in December, the legislative leaders set aside $150 million for tax cuts, and that's a starting point. It could go much higher. The only thing that is going to put a limit on what they want to do in terms of tax cuts is, as you alluded to, in inflation. The numbers that came out this week showing that inflation jumped 7% over the last year, it's freaking them out a little bit. They're really, really worried about that because that's going to really put a damper on the economy, on how much things cost, and so they're going to work really hard to balance both of those things. So you see a lot of enthusiasm for tax cuts, but inflation is just a cold water on that.
So we kind of have an idea with some of the bills that have already been filed as to how Republicans in the legislature are thinking as far as like income tax cuts and whatnot. But we have a lot of advocates saying, slow down, let's maybe use this money for important programs in the state of Utah. How do you see this all playing out in the end?
Tax cuts, the Republicans have already decided that they want to do tax cuts, so that's what's going to happen. When you see the Executive Appropriations Committee, which is the top budgeting committee in the entire legislature, set aside that money for tax cuts, then you're getting tax cuts. That's how it's going to work. They've already done most of the spending for education. They do that before the session. It's locked in because of the way that they changed the budgeting process a couple of years ago to head off the Our Schools Now budget initiative or ballot initiative. So a lot of this stuff is already locked in. Now that doesn't mean that they're not going to be spending money on some of these programs, but if at this point they say that they're putting aside money for tax cuts is what is going to happen.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Let's take another subject that's really been getting a lot of attention, and that is this power struggle we're seeing play out between local governments and state legislators, specifically the mayors of Salt Lake County and Salt Lake City. We've seen the majority leader in the House, Representative Mike Schultz, come out and say, that they do not have the authority to do the things they're doing as far as mask mandates, and we saw this playing out at the 4th of July with fireworks as well. He promised to take a look at this and possibly address it. What are we going to see happen there?
I think you're going to see the legislature assert its primacy up there. I was having a conversation with a member of legislative leadership last week about the Salt Lake County mask mandate. And I said to them, I thought the legislature was all about local control, because one of the things that they love saying is government that is closest to the people governs best. And they said to me, and I'm not going to give any names, but they said to me, we believe in local control until the locals need controlling. And that's pretty much how it works. The entire philosophy up there is when you look at cities and counties, they are political subdivisions of the state, and the legislature sets the policy for the state. So, you'll hear them talk about local control until the locals do something that they don't like.
Yeah, and we saw that play out with the governor and Salt Lake County Mayor Jenny Wilson during the week with their dispute as to, the impact of the county mandate on state buildings. Do you think, so you do think the legislature will maybe tie up some of these loopholes and limit some of the power of local mayors?
I'm guessing that they do something in regards to Salt Lake City Mayor Erin Mendenhall. When she declared a mask mandate, there were a lot of people who thought that lawmakers were going to call a special session to override it or do something through the courts. ultimately they thought it wasn't that big of a deal, or it was the juice wasn't worth the squeeze at that point. But I do suspect that they're going to do something to clarify that a mayor does not have that ability.
Yeah. The last couple of years we've seen transgender sports coming up, and we know that they've been working on that in the interim as well. Do you see the two sides coming together and possibly coming up with something that both might be able to get behind?
I do, because they have a bill that came out of the interim committee, and there was a lot of negotiation about that. I reported during last year's session that when this bill was making its way through the process, that the owner of the Utah Jazz, Ryan Smith, held a meeting with lawmakers behind the scenes and basically did a lot to slow it down, say we need to talk about this, we need to spend more time looking at it, and that's exactly what they did. And you know, ultimately, whatever bill comes out of it is probably going to not make everybody happy, but that's usually the sign of a good piece of legislation, or at least a sign that they tried to work together.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I want to get your thoughts on this as well. We're starting to see Silicon Slopes become more of a player on Utah's Capitol Hill, and in some cases calling out state lawmakers. Do you see perhaps a power struggle between those two entities playing out?
Yeah, but you know, so Silicon Slopes is one area of the state, and they've got a lot of money to throw around. But you know, just like any other legislative group or any other special interest group, you know, they'll push as far as lawmakers want them to push. If they try to go any farther, they're going to run into a brick wall, because the legislature as a whole, you know, you've got 104 individuals, and it's really hard to get them going in one direction. So you know, it takes good leadership, and to just think that you're going to come in and throw a bunch of money around in the way of campaign donations, or you're going to come in and have some paid lobbyists, that's not going to do it. You really have to get you really have to have leadership on board.
Yeah. How is COVID going to impact this session? We're starting to see cases that we've never seen before, as far as the volume of them. Do you see a lot of remote activity taking place again this year?
Oh, no, I do not. You know, lawmakers have said to me that they need to start acting as if it's no longer a pandemic, but COVID is endemic, meaning it's going to be here. And I think that is the emerging conventional wisdom up on the Hill. They're not going to go remote unless there's like a huge reason to, unless there's an exigent thing that happens that causes them to do such.
Yeah, and back to something we brought up earlier, the state capitol right in the mix of that battle between the governor and the Salt Lake County mayor. So far, it is being exempt from the county.
I was up there. I was up there last week for a couple of things, and I think I was the only person wearing a mask.
Yeah. Brian, you do a great job covering the session. You'll be there every single day. 45 days. It's a little different this year in that it's starting on a Tuesday, ending on a Friday. But how can our viewers follow along your reporting and stay in touch with what's happening up on the Hill?
Well, they can always read the Trib, or they can sign up for my email newsletter. It's called The Rundown. It's in your email inbox every weekday morning by 6:30, and it's a great way to start your day.
And on Twitter?
Shot Happens.
Follow you there, yep. All right. Hey, really appreciate your insight. Looking
Anytime,
forward to the session, and we will check in with you another time. Thanks for being here. Still ahead, we're going to have more on the upcoming legislative session. Senate leadership will be here to share their thoughts a little bit later in our panel discussion. But first, hospitals are being inundated by a record number of COVID patients. How the president's team is responding after the break. Welcome back. New inflation numbers out, confirming what we've all been feeling. Prices for almost everything are up, and they're expected to keep climbing. Washington correspondent Trevor Shirley has the latest from the nation's capital.
Inflation now stands to wipe out most wage increases that many Americans have received over the past several months.
Well, that means that your paycheck or your next paycheck will be worth 7 cents less per dollar than it was before.
According to data, the prices on food, energy, and rent have all gone up. The inflation spike is happening as Americans ramped up spending on things like cars, furniture, and appliances. Economists say those purchases put even more strain on an already stressed supply chain.
There is work to do clearly in eliminating the supply chain bottlenecks, in skill training, and other measures that will make more goods available to help reduce prices.
Data now shows lower-income families are having an even tougher time affording the basics.
If you look back through history, there are times when wages have moved up in a way that has fostered persistent inflation, and that hurts everyone. It particularly hurts people on fixed incomes.
On Tuesday, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell admitted the Fed mistakenly believed the supply chain backup would end sooner and prices would come down. That backlog, though, has persisted. Powell said the Fed is prepared to hike interest rates this year as a way of slowing down inflation.
If we see inflation persisting at high levels longer than expected, then we will, if we have to raise interest rates more over time, we will.
That was Trevor Shirley reporting for us. Members of the president's COVID team were questioned by senators during the week as the virus is on the rise and health systems are inundated with a record number of hospitalizations. Washington correspondent Basil John reports as senators demand solutions from experts on what can be done to address these problems.
With the U.S. struggling to deal with Omicron, White House Chief Medical Advisor Dr. Anthony Fauci says the next challenge is preparing for future variants.
The rapid development and implementation of successful countermeasures against several prototype pathogen families of viruses.
Virginia Democratic Senator Tim Kaine is concerned about new vaccine development.
Is the administration considering supporting the development of additional vaccines that might be able to address the gaps in the current vaccine's capabilities?
Yes, absolutely. I think we all see the need for next generation vaccines.
Democrats and Republicans shared concerns about schools. Health experts say the solutions to keeping kids in the classroom are vaccinations and testing programs.
So we saw through the Delta surge that we were able to keep our children safely in school before we had vaccines.
Health officials also clarified what being exposed to the virus means in the age of Omicron.
We're in a room right now. I'm sure someone here has Omicron. Are we all exposed and therefore need to get tested?
You should get tested if you have symptoms of COVID-19. If you do a rapid at-home test and you continue to have symptoms and that test is negative, you should do another test or get a PCR.
Reporting in Washington, I'm Basil John.
Coming up, state lawmakers have some big plans for the legislative session. We're checking in with Senate leadership after the break.
You're watching Inside Utah Politics.
Time now to dig deeper into the legislative session with the Inside Utah Politics panel. This week we have Senate Majority Assistant Whip Kirk Colomar and Senate Minority Caucus Manager Gene Davis. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. Thanks, Glenn.
Senator Colomar, let's start with you. What are your thoughts? Session kicking off now in just a couple of days as we head in to the 45-day session.
Well, it's that time of year. There's obviously going to be a lot going on over the next 45 days. Some of the big issues are we're looking at pretty significant surpluses again. Whether that has to do with, how much of that has to do with the federal stimulus that's happened over the last couple years is what we need to be cautious about. And so, you know, in assigning some of this as one-time money or ongoing money, we need to be cognizant of, you know, is this an inflated amount, or is this something that we can rely on? And so we'll rely heavily on our fiscal analysts and make sure that we remain fiscally prudent state.
Yeah, that's a good point, because we're dealing with historic inflation levels at this point. So we'll get more into that as we discuss the session. But Senator Davis, let's bring you in. Your thoughts as we head into the session?
I think this is going to be probably one of the most important sessions that I have been able to serve in the Utah State Legislature. As was mentioned, we have all of this surplus money. Most of it is all one-time money and not ongoing money. There's a lot of issues that we need to address. There's needs of state that truly need to be addressed. I think wages are one of those issues that we need to make sure that our state employees are compensated appropriately with the inflation and everything else that's going on. So that's going to be a major issue, I believe, also.
We've already got a sense of what tax breaks may look like through a couple of bills that have already been presented. So, Senator Collimore, as far as tax cuts go, what are you and your colleagues in the majority thinking?
Well, the Executive Appropriations Committee has already set aside $160 million, and so we saw pretty significant income tax cuts last year, and they were pretty targeted. So the discussion is that it'll maybe be a more broad-based income tax cut this year, and even a bigger tax cut than what we did last year. What the exact amount, whether we use the whole 160 or if we go more than 160, that'll be up for debate. But I think that's where the discussion is moving right now, is a broad-based income tax cut for everybody.
Senator Davis, your thoughts and your caucus on more of a broad approach this time around as opposed to targeted?
I think the one thing we have to do is be very, very cautious about this growth, that it's not, going to be short-lived. We've got to take a look at downturn in the economy. If we cut taxes too deeply, then it means that we have really a serious deep cut when the economy goes south. And we know over time that economies are up and down. There's good times, and then there's some pretty tough times, and we need to make sure that we can cover the tough times as we address these good times.
Senator Collimore, I want to dig more into this inflation idea. How might that change or impact your thinking as you take a look at what to do with this surplus and the most effective way to use it?
Well, Senator Davis is right. We need to be prudent about this and try to recognize that we potentially are in a bubble, and so we need to, we want to spread the money out amongst the people of Utah, but we got to be prudent about it and make sure that we're not, doing something where we do have to make significant cuts in state services or potentially look at raising taxes again. And so we'll certainly be careful about that, but we've also seen income or sales tax increases as well, and so a lot of that may be characterized as one-time money, and with a lot of that, what we'd like to do is make generational investments into infrastructure and stuff like that, those one-time funds can be used for something that affects all of us and for many years into the future, and not incur more ongoing obligations.
Senator Davis, we've had some advocates on the show, children advocates, cultural advocates, et cetera, saying, let's slow down a little. Maybe we don't need to look at these tax cuts and fund some more programs for the community. Your thoughts on that?
We have some real shortages and needs that need to be addressed with our disabled community. We need to do some investments in there and lower down that waiting list that we've been addressing for a long, long time. There's education, of course, is always at the forefront in how we deal with education, making sure that higher education and job training in the state of Utah is at its peak, and we need to make sure that we're giving young people opportunities to grow into the future.
Senator Collimore, your thoughts on that? Every year there are people who request money or organizations that request money that don't make the cut, so why not maybe focus some of that surplus on more spending that can impact the community?
I think there'll be plenty of spending this year. Even with the tax cuts that we're talking about, the $160 million for income tax cut, we're looking at over $1 billion surplus. And so there's plenty of money that's going to be spent this year. Everybody's talking about increasing the wages for state employees and looking at a lot of those social services that we're not quite meeting those needs. And so I'm pretty confident that a lot of spending is going to happen. It's just, can we do it in the right way, in the Utah way, and meet those tax cuts? And I think it can be done, and I think we'll find that.
Okay, we will be watching that, and as that plays out. Senator Davis, anything troubling you've heard on the table that causes you concern?
I think one of the major issues, and it's going to be a major issue up there, is water, and how we're dealing with our water crisis in the state of Utah, and where we go from here, really, in addressing the future. We've got to look at that. I think also getting an awful lot of discussion this session is going to be issues around the Great Salt Lake. We've got to make sure for air quality, soil quality, in fact, our quality of life in the state of Utah, that we don't damage the Great Salt Lake any deeply more than it is right now.
Yeah, and that's something that has become a bipartisan issue, people on both sides stepping up and saying this is a priority. Senator Collimore, what is the majority looking at as far as real solutions when it comes to water conservation?
So we still have quite a bit of money left from ARPA, the relief package from the feds. And so one of the big investments that we're looking at is secondary water metering. And that's, a lot of citizens in our state, particularly in the northern Utah counties and some in Utah County as well as some in Salt Lake County, have secondary water sources for their yards and all that, and they're not metered. And there's been a lot of studies that show simply by metering it, not changing the price or anything, but simply by metering it, people are more aware of the amount of water they're using, and there's big conservation expectations when that happens. And we could invest a lot of money into new water infrastructure, and that's something that we'll look at as well. But just the secondary water metering, which will be several $100 million, could save us enough water that would amount to basically a brand new reservoir. And so it'd be a big investment, but worthwhile.
All right, I want to get both your thoughts on another issue we've seen playing out quite a bit in the last year, particularly with fireworks on the 4th of July and the pandemic mask mandates. We've seen this power struggle between the state legislature and local mayors, Salt Lake City and Salt Lake County. Do you anticipate, Senator Collimore, you and your colleagues addressing that and maybe closing some of these loopholes or defining it more when it comes to emergency powers for local city authorities?
I am aware of at least one, if not a couple, bills that will look into clarifying this, because you're right, it gets messy when you have cities that are implementing mandates that others may think is outside of their jurisdictional purview. And so we do need to clean it up, and I think it's for the benefit of the cities and for the state and for the citizens, so that we can avoid these types of fights and these types of arguments, and make sure that mandates or requirements or anything like this goes through the correct process and has that correct public input and has some form of legislative process.
Senator Davis, do you believe that you and your colleagues need to tighten up the law in this area?
I take a look at a lot of these issues that are coming up around the COVID, around the pandemic. We need to really give a great ear to our public health people. They're professionals. They know what the problem is, and we need to be able to follow their lead and give them the direction that they need to really implement good public health so that we all live in a safer environment. And that includes, other issues that are there as well. And local governments closest to the people, they understand. In Panguitch, for an example, some of the issues there are not the same as you find in Salt Lake County.
All right, on that note, we're going to have to end it there, gentlemen. Great conversation. Thanks so much for being here. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Stay with us. We'll be right back with more Inside Utah Politics right after the break. We leave you now with a look at what's on the radar in the world of politics. We've been talking about it all morning. The general legislative session, it begins this Tuesday. Governor Spencer Cox will deliver his State of the State address on Thursday, and then the final day of the session is Friday, March 4th. Make sure to connect with me on social media. I'd like to know what you think of this show and other issues that are important to you. You can email me at InsideUtahPolitics@abc4.com. You can also follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Thanks so much for making us part of your Sunday morning. We hope to see you again next week as we go inside Utah politics.